Don't watch them hunt. It wasn't a formal order, but a whispered warning among U.S. intelligence. When the Australians went to work at night, look away. The men of the Australian Special Air Service Regiment weren't just soldiers. They were hunters, shadows of the jungle, moving in silence so complete it erased their presence. Elite patrols would go 14 days without speaking, eating local food, drinking from swamp water, blending with the earth itself. Their efficiency was staggering. 6 years of high-risk operations, and only 2 men lost. Enemy casualties far outnumbered theirs, often 50-1. Summer of 1967, Bien Hoa Province. A U.S. Army intelligence officer stepped off a Huey onto the scorched landing pad. He recoiled at a stench that was neither fish nor rot. It was something darker. Ahead, 5 men emerged, encased in dried swamp mud from jaw to boot. Faces obscured, eyes hollow and unblinking. These weren't exhausted infantry or prisoners. They were operators returning from 30 days deep inside Viet Cong territory. Without a single radio call, hot meal, or word spoken, they had become hunters in human form. The officer's field report would haunt Pentagon rooms for years. Their eyes had ceased to blink. They might no longer even be considered human. From that day, a term surfaced quietly in Allied documents: the Night Rights. Decorated Green Berets, seasoned by Fort Bragg's harshest programs, returned from joint missions pale, silent, and unwilling to file detailed reports. Why did U.S. liaison officers receive quiet instructions to absent themselves from Australian night operations, or simply look the other way? The answers lay buried in a chapter of the Vietnam War that remained classified for decades. Understanding the Australians' methods meant first understanding the radical difference between American and Australian warfare. U.S. doctrine relied on 3 pillars: firepower, technology, and unbroken communication. Radios checked in every 30 minutes. Air support and artillery were summoned at the first enemy sighting. The jungle roared with helicopters, artillery, and radio chatter. Silence meant failure or death. Americans fought loud. The Australians operated differently. Their doctrine was absolute silence, literal and disciplined. A 5 to 6 man patrol would vanish into the jungle for up to 14 days. Not a whisper, not a single syllable. Communication relied on over 120 precise hand signals conveying movement, enemy type, numbers, and psychological state. This silence alone baffled U.S. intelligence. Signals operators, trained to interpret every crackle of radio traffic, were driven to panic by days of uninterrupted silence. Standard protocol demanded emergency searches, but the Australians reassured calmly everything was proceeding as planned. Yet silence was only the outer layer. Australian SAS patrols achieved results that broke every Pentagon model. They located enemy camps and troop movements days before U.S. sensors, executed ambushes with near-perfect kill ratios, and operated without air support, artillery, or functional radios. Their effectiveness forced American officers to demand audits. The numbers were real. Underlying these operations was total environmental integration. Weeks before a mission, SAS operators discarded hygiene products, toothpaste, deodorant, anything that altered their natural scent. Sea rations were abandoned for locally sourced food to mimic jungle odors. They literally became part of the environment. Aboriginal trackers instructed them in reading the terrain, footprints, bent grass, and soil impressions, extracting details on direction, weight, fatigue, and probable locations. They read the jungle like a living map, detecting movement invisible to ordinary observers. Combined silence, scent, invisibility, and predatory tracking created what the Viet Cong feared most: Ma Rung, the jungle ghosts. The term was not admiration, it was primal terror. Soldiers who had faced artillery and ambushes were unnerved by unseen hunters who observed them, knew them, and could strike without warning. American officers often confessed later they could hardly see these men as human. They had become predators, part of the jungle itself. The night rites were devastatingly effective, but not without cost. Weeks of silence, rejection of hygiene, and living in primitive conditions inflicted psychological trauma. PTSD rates among SAS veterans were higher than among regular infantry, despite fewer physical losses. Returning home, many struggled with sleep, intimacy, and the sensory shocks of civilization. Their effectiveness in the field became a curse in everyday life. For U.S. Command, the results were undeniable, yet the methods were too extreme to acknowledge publicly. Pride and conventional doctrine prevented learning from the Australians. Small, silent groups outperformed battalions bristling with technology and firepower. Only decades later would Western forces adopt similar tactics in conflicts like Afghanistan. The Australians had mastered a war that others were not yet ready to see, and the jungle bore witness to it silently, efficiently, and lethally. The sun disappeared behind the ridges, leaving the jungle in deep darkness. Mercer led his team carefully, muscles coiled, senses alert. The silence pressed against them, broken only by distant calls of unseen creatures. They were invisible not just to the enemy, they were becoming invisible to themselves, stripped of normal life by weeks of discipline, training, and survival. Their target was a small Viet Cong outpost near the Dong Nai River, known to host couriers and intelligence officers. The mission seemed simple: approach, observe, and extract information. But perfection was demanded. Every step had to be measured. Any mistake could mean death. Patrol routes, guard shifts, and natural sounds had been memorized. Mercer signaled the squad to halt. 2 sentries moved along the perimeter, their pattern subtle but precise. Timing each glance, Mercer planned the approach, instructing the team with hand gestures carrying exact meaning. Herrera moved forward first, crawling inch by inch. Kane followed, mimicking each movement. Mercer scanned for threats. They were ghosts, senses sharpened, aware of everything around them. Inside the outpost, the team worked silently. Documents were catalogued, messages photographed, intelligence secured. Not a single sound escaped. Each operator acted as part of a single organism. Extraction was timed to the second. Emerging from the outpost, Mercer guided the team along a concealed route to the riverbank. Every step accounted for. The helicopter's rotor became audible just as they reached the pickup point. One by one, they boarded silently, the jungle receding behind them. Back at base, debriefings were meticulous. Every observation was recorded and verified. The intelligence gathered would inform operations for weeks. Mercer reminded his men, success was not for recognition, but for control and survival. Kane asked quietly if they ever stopped being like this, transformed by the jungle. Mercer replied, "The jungle leaves a mark, both a burden and a gift." Days passed with preparation, silent movement, and observation. Each mission honed their senses. The jungle became a second skin. Operators returned changed, bodies and minds tuned to a world the rest of the Army could barely understand. The effectiveness of their tactics was clear. They disrupted supply lines, captured high-value targets, and inflicted losses far beyond conventional units. U.S. command could not ignore the results, but struggled to acknowledge the extreme methods. Silence, patience, and precise tracking had replaced artillery and airstrikes as decisive factors. One mission intercepted a courier carrying vital codes. The team moved for 2 days, following tracks so faint only trained eyes could see. Mercer signaled pauses and advances, timing every step to the jungle's natural rhythm. They cornered the courier without alerting surrounding patrols. Extraction was clean, silent, complete. No gunfire, no alarm, no trace left behind. Another operation targeted an enemy supply cache. Operators moved through treacherous terrain, crossing rivers, avoiding traps, and remaining undetectable. When they reached the location, they dismantled the network silently. Their training in scent masking, silent movement, and aboriginal tracking allowed operations invisible to conventional military analysis. The psychological toll was evident. Weeks of silence, foraging, and constant vigilance left deep marks. Operators returned with altered sleep patterns, hypersensitivity to noise, and difficulty reintegrating into normal life. Yet results justified the methods: fewer casualties, disproportionate impact on enemy operations, and intelligence impossible to gather through conventional means. Mercer observed the men as they prepared for another mission. The jungle demanded focus, and they had internalized every rhythm, sound, and shadow. They were predators, attuned to the environment, aware of the human cost of their transformation. Each carried the knowledge that their effectiveness came with permanent consequences. American officers expressed awe and fear. SAS methods, unlike conventional warfare, were unsettling. They challenged assumptions, disrupted doctrine, and forced command to reconsider combat. These men were not just soldiers. They embodied ancient knowledge of survival, movement, and predation, applied with ruthless precision. And yet, the jungle remained a relentless teacher. Every mission tested endurance, focus, and understanding. Failure was immediate and absolute. Success demanded full integration with the environment. The Australians had mastered this, but it demanded every ounce of discipline, patience, and suppression of ordinary human instincts. Through it all, Mercer maintained perspective. They operated in a world governed not by noise and firepower, but by silence, observation, and meticulous calculation. Every mission reinforced a single truth: the predator survives not through strength alone, but through understanding, patience, and invisibility. Night fell over the dense jungles of Bien Hoa Province, a heavy darkness that seemed to press against the skin and silence every sound. Mercer and his team moved like shadows, each step deliberate, calculated. The night was their ally, the enemy unaware of the hunters moving through their midst. The transformation that had begun during daylight hours intensified here. Operators became extensions of the forest itself, senses attuned to the faintest sound, the slightest shift in the undergrowth. Their mission tonight was to extract a Viet Cong officer carrying critical intelligence. The approach had been rehearsed for days. Routes were memorized, guard rotations studied, and even the subtle patterns of nocturnal wildlife accounted for. Every detail mattered because the jungle did not forgive mistakes. Mercer signaled for a halt. Ahead, a sentry silhouette emerged against the faint glow of the riverbank. Timing was everything. The man glanced away for 2 seconds. Herrera inched forward, low to the earth, his body barely disturbing the soil. Kane followed, movement synchronized with Mercer's silent cues. Each breath was controlled, each heartbeat tempered. The operator's eyes, unblinking and wide, scanned the perimeter, absorbing shadows and shapes. Inside the outpost, the team moved with surgical precision. No weapon spoke, no sound betrayed them. Documents were secured, messages photographed, and the target located without alerting surrounding guards. Extraction required delicate coordination. 3 men lifted the officer, carefully restraining him, avoiding noise, and moving back toward the jungle's concealment. Every second had been accounted for, every movement rehearsed to perfection. Emerging from the perimeter, they traversed narrow trails lined with roots and loose soil, advancing like predators. The riverbank, their extraction point, was reached just as the faint hum of the helicopter approached. They boarded silently, the jungle fading behind them, leaving no trace of their passage. The operation was a success, and yet the psychological cost was immediate. Weeks of silence, hunger, and complete focus on survival created a transformation that left the operators partially estranged from the world beyond the jungle. Another operation tested the team's patience and endurance in a different way. They set up an ambush along a trail used by Viet Cong patrols, a route critical for resupply and communication. 5 operators lay motionless for 6 days, embedded in the foliage, enduring tropical heat, insects, and constant discomfort. Their breathing slowed, movements minimized, and natural needs accommodated without changing posture. They became part of the forest floor, invisible, silent, lethal. When the enemy fell into their trap, the outcome was swift and devastating. Engagements lasted no more than a few minutes, conducted at point-blank range with knives and steel clubs. Targets were neutralized efficiently, documents collected, and the team vanished as quietly as they had arrived. Each ambush reinforced a single principle. Stealth, patience, and discipline could achieve what artillery and air power could not. American liaison officers watched these operations with a mixture of awe and fear. Men trained in conventional warfare could not comprehend the extent of the Australians' skill. Weeks of preparation, biological adaptation, and extreme tracking proficiency had produced a type of soldier that seemed almost inhuman. Their gaze was fixed, unblinking, movements smooth and calculated. Psychologists would later call this predatory fixation, a state in which the eye freezes on the target and all other awareness diminishes. Mercer knew the cost. The transformation required to operate at this level left permanent marks on the psyche. Silence, deprivation, and immersion in the jungle's rhythm created men capable of extraordinary feats but vulnerable outside the environment. Sleep was difficult, social reintegration challenging, and the memory of bloodless, precise kills haunted many operators long after they left the field. Yet the effectiveness was undeniable. Operations disrupted Viet Cong networks, captured high-value targets, and inflicted losses far exceeding what conventional units could achieve. The Australian Special Air Service Regiment became a force invisible to conventional detection. A predator operating in dimensions of warfare the American command had never encountered. The night was relentless. On another mission, the team tracked a courier for days, using Aboriginal-inspired tracking techniques to read subtle signs. Footprints, broken vegetation, soil impressions. These indicators revealed not only direction and speed, but approximate weight, cargo, and likely stops. American trackers, relying on maps and radios, could determine movement, but the Australians could infer intent, fatigue, and next positions. This four-dimensional approach to tracking allowed them to operate undetected while gathering critical intelligence. Extraction was always precise. The target would be neutralized or captured, intelligence secured, and the team vanished into the jungle. Operations like this were repeated dozens of times, with success rates exceeding 80%, all without reliance on radios, artillery, or heavy weapons. The combination of silence, environmental adaptation, and superior tracking created a force that was simultaneously feared, respected, and misunderstood. As dawn approached, Mercer led his men back to the base, each operator exhausted but composed. They had completed another flawless operation, invisible to friend and foe alike. The jungle, ever demanding, had exacted its toll, and yet it had rewarded their discipline and understanding with success. Every mission reinforced the lesson Mercer had internalized. The jungle rewards those who listen, wait, and move as one with the environment. The Australians' methods challenged conventional thinking. While American forces relied on technology, noise, and firepower, the SAS had perfected a human-centric approach. Success depended on perception, patience, and integration with nature itself. These men became invisible hunters, ghosts in the foliage, a nightmare the Viet Cong could neither see nor anticipate. The sun rose over the dense canopy of the Mekong Delta, casting streaks of gold through the mist. Mercer watched his team move quietly through the base, now familiar shadows in the early morning light. Their work in the jungle had changed them in ways few could comprehend. They were effective, feared, and invisible, but the cost was deeply human. The transformation that allowed them to operate as predators left marks that would not fade once they returned to civilization. Each operator carried memories of missions that pushed the limits of endurance and skill, weeks of silence, weeks without hygiene, subsisting entirely on foraged food and local rations, and months of total focus on tracking and observation had reshaped them. Men who had once been ordinary soldiers now walked as shadows, eyes always scanning, ears always alert, bodies conditioned to move without notice. The efficiency of these methods had saved lives in the field, but outside the jungle, the effects were unsettling. Sleep came in fits, social interactions felt alien, and ordinary sounds sometimes provoked panic. Command officers in Washington had long recognized the results, but struggled to reconcile them with conventional military doctrine. The Australians achieved more with 5 or 6 operators than entire battalions armed with artillery and air support. Yet the techniques were so alien, so radically different from American doctrine, that acknowledgement was reluctant. Pride and tradition created resistance to adopting what seemed almost supernatural in effectiveness. Mercer led his team into a briefing room where maps and intelligence reports were spread across the table. Targets had been identified for the upcoming month, each requiring the same discipline, patience, and precision that had defined past operations. Every detail had been studied, from guard rotations to local terrain conditions, to ensure zero margin for error. The operations would continue, as relentless as the jungle itself. Each mission reinforced the same principle. Success relied on absolute integration with the environment, total discipline, and the ability to become invisible, silent, and predatory. Operators understood that the jungle rewarded patience and punished any deviation from calculated movement. Mistakes were immediate and unforgiving. Perfection was demanded at every stage. Psychological resilience was critical. Operators needed to suppress ordinary human instincts, noise, haste, even the need for comfort. The jungle was a mirror, reflecting only what it allowed. Those who became predators survived. Those who did not became casualties of their own limitations. Every patrol reinforced the lesson that mastery of the environment was as important as mastery of combat skills. American liaison officers continued to observe with awe and fear. The techniques challenged every assumption about modern warfare. Silence, environmental adaptation, and advanced tracking created a force that seemed almost inhuman. Soldiers returned from patrols unshaken externally, but forever changed internally. The transformation that enabled unmatched effectiveness in the jungle was a psychological burden, one that few outside the regiment could understand. On a particularly complex operation, Mercer's team tracked a high-ranking Viet Cong officer across rivers, swamps, and dense foliage for days. Their movement was calculated, methodical, synchronized with the natural rhythms of the jungle. Every track, every broken leaf, every shifted pebble was a clue. By reading the environment, they predicted enemy movement with precision far beyond conventional intelligence. When they finally captured the target, not a single guard had been alerted. The intelligence gathered would prevent attacks, disrupt supply lines, and save countless lives. Yet the cost remained visible. Operators often returned unable to sleep in beds, sensitive to ordinary scents, and disconnected from normal social interaction. Weeks of immersion in the predator's mindset made the human world feel alien. Psychologists later described this as a form of lasting predatory conditioning. The jungle, once a classroom, became a permanent part of their consciousness. The Australians had achieved what others could not. They had turned the human body and mind into instruments of war, blending biology, instinct, and centuries of traditional tracking knowledge. Success was measured not only in enemy losses, but in the survival of their own men. Over 6 years, the regiment lost only 2 operators in combat, a testament to their preparation, skill, and integration with the environment. By contrast, conventional units suffered heavy casualties, despite technological and numerical superiority. Mercer reflected on the lessons for modern warfare. Technology alone could not replace understanding, patience, and adaptability. The Australians' methods would influence future special operations, though only decades later. Their success underscored the importance of training, observation, and environmental mastery, proving that the human mind and body, when pushed to the extreme, could achieve feats beyond conventional expectation. In the end, the legacy of these men was both inspiring and tragic. Their efficiency saved lives and disrupted the enemy. but the psychological toll was profound. The jungle had created hunters, men capable of feats no ordinary soldier could match, but in doing so, had permanently altered them. The price of mastery was high, the reward undeniable, and the methods largely misunderstood by allies and superiors alike. As the sun climbed, Mercer led his team into the dense green once more. Another mission awaited, another challenge that demanded silence, patience, and precision. The jungle was eternal, relentless, and unforgiving, and the hunters had become part of it. Each step reinforced the lessons learned, each operation a reminder of the balance between power and cost, effectiveness and humanity. They were ghosts, predators, and warriors, bound forever to a world that few could understand, operating in shadows, where survival demanded everything.